Director, writer Ty West from X and Pell fame brings us The House of the Devil from 2009. And this one stars Jocelyn Donahue, but also stars quite a famous person in 2023, Greta Gerwig, who you may know as the director of the Barbie movie. You've also got a couple of recognisable genre actors, Tom Noonan and Dee Wallace, turn up in this film. So this is a kind of movie which is made in 2009, but to emulate the films of the 80s. So I believe it takes place in 1983 and effectively is filmed in the style of an 80s movie. Apparently they used 16mm cameras to get the kind of the feel of an 80s film, and they go to great lengths to recreate the style of filmmaking from the 80s. So ultimately it follows this young girl who has kind of moved to this particular area to go to kind of university, and she's struggling for money, so she takes this job as a babysitter, which pays very highly one night, from Tom Noonan's character, who's this strange man in this kind of large house. When they go to this house, initially she goes with her friend, played by Greta Gerwig. We find out there's not actually kids, it's apparently an elderly woman. And she's initially reluctant to kind of do that, having not had any kind of medical training. But she's talked into it by large sums of cash. However, there may be a surreptitious reason for wanting this kind of girl to stay in this house, as Tom Noonan and his cronies are apparently Satanists and want to kind of do bad things to this young woman. Now, what will happen? You'll have to watch the movie and find out. So let's discuss what I think works in this film. So one thing I would say is I think they do, Ty West does a good job here of recreating the kind of the feel of an 80s movie. As I said, he's used a 16mm camera to give it a feel, but also things like just the hair, the kind of the props, the kind of the way they've kind of used zooms, although I would say that's arguably more of a 70s trait than an 80s, but there you go. But yeah, it's a good attempt here, I think, of emulating a film from the kind of the 80s and things like that. So that was pretty good. I think the acting is solid. I believed our kind of characters, and they do seem both, that everyone seems kind of like to be acting to a high standard, but also acting in a way that would be typical of an 80s movie. So hats off to the kind of the cast here. The movie's relatively gentle and slow for the most part, but it is punctuated with some kind of scenes of violence, but they come kind of quite out of nowhere. So when you do have these sequences, they're going to hit pretty hard. So otherwise it seems to be a fairly kind of like strolling pace. And then all of a sudden you have a couple of instances where you'll see something far more kind of overtly kind of horrific, which I think makes those sequences quite effective. The story isn't necessarily anything you haven't seen before, but it's nonetheless an intriguing kind of idea here. And obviously it being kind of set in the early 80s, this was when you had the full-blown Satanic panic, of course, and that was quite a big thing back in the kind of the early 80s, and it's sort of tapped into that kind of fear and kind of paranoia. As I've mentioned, I think the kind of like the kind of the set design is excellent here, but they do a good job with just the kind of like the things like the cinematography and framing and kind of the way this kind of movie is just put together on a kind of technical level. You can see that Ty West was certainly a kind of a talented filmmaker. Even back with his early films, I recently reviewed the movie Roost, which I believe was his first major film. And again, you have some skill on display even in the earlier films, so it's understandable he's found success kind of later on. There are some pretty good effects here. It's few and far between, but when we do see the kind of VFX and kind of makeup, practical makeup, things like that, I would say it's done to a good effect. What doesn't work for me in this film, I think the main issue is, as I've mentioned, the film is relatively kind of slow paced and quite a gentle film in some ways, and I think to a point it's at its detriment. Now, that I would suggest this movie, the first half of it, which is effectively the kind of the character building, is strong. I feel like you get to grips knowing our characters and getting a good sense of who they are, you know, what their kind of motivations and their positions are with one another. And that's down to obviously the acting and obviously the kind of the direction and writing as well. But to me, I think when we actually get in more to the kind of the horror element and the more of the kind of the horror side of the story, which is ultimately where our main character is left alone in this house, the movie gets a little bit too slow, I think, and there's just maybe a few too many scenes where we have Jocelyn Donahue's character just kind of like walking around the house and kind of like milling around, kind of looking at things, and you don't really feel it's got a massive forward momentum. And I think the character work was so good in the first half. It's a shame that doesn't kind of like really capitalise on you know, it's kind of like skill and setup. Really, you feel it kind of just sits back and kind of let's walk around a spooky house for a little while. And yeah, it's a spooky house, I won't lie. And you know, obviously there's a couple of things that happens, but it's really right towards the end, to be honest. So I feel the pacing of this movie may be a little bit kind of like ultimately slow and therefore a little dull for some people. I have to say as well, when we do start seeing the more overt horror elements, and this happens right towards the conclusion of this movie, I don't know if that really worked for me either. I think sometimes the movie, it just seems quite generic, unfortunately, and it's never a bad film, I would suggest, but the movie just doesn't seem particularly kind of interesting. And even when we have our kind of our finale, it's a little on the weaker side. Again, it's not necessarily a bad movie or a bad finale, but it's nothing you haven't seen before. I feel it ended with a little bit of a whimper rather than a kind of a bang. I feel that the payoff isn't particularly kind of strong. So ultimately, I think this movie starts off pretty well, but then it never becomes like a bad film necessarily, but it just becomes a little bit vanilla, a little bit generic as we kind of go into the kind of the second half of the movie, and I think loses that sort of specialness that it kind of built up in that first half. But that being said, I mean, obviously, you know, a good first half and an okay second half doesn't make it for a bad film, and then ultimately when you can put it together, it makes for probably an above average film, if we're being honest. And like I've said, I do think there's been care taken on this movie to kind of give it this kind of this 80s feel, and therefore, you know, I'll give this movie a 6 out of 10. It's a well put together film. I don't know if it has much in the way of like rewatchability factor or anything like that. I think it's probably in a reasonable one-time watch, but it's not going to blow your socks off, I don't think. So it's a 6 out of 10 for me. Have you seen it? What did you think? Please do leave me a comment, and I shall look forward to seeing you next time.